The Milwaukee Journal Green Sheet was a popular feature section of the newspaper for decades. The former editor of the Green Sheet joins me to highlight what was the favorite part of the paper for many of us. Dan Chabot is my special guest next on I Remember. Hi, I'm Jim Peck. Welcome to I Remember. Joining me tonight is Dan Chabot, a newspaper veteran who spent 25 years at the Milwaukee Journal. From 1981 to 1994, he was the editor of a very special section of the paper, the Green Sheet. Take a look.
In the 1920s, the Milwaukee Journal Green Sheet was a tabloid addition to papers sold on the street. Originally introduced before World War I to deliver late-breaking news and sports, it expanded in the 30s but maintained its distinctive color. Rush Hour extras once included another colorful insert, the Peach Sheet, such as this one announcing the death of Adolf Hitler in 1945, but it was the Green Sheet that became a much longer fixture of the paper. Larry Lawrence was the editor from 1927 to 61, overseeing the transformation to the Green Sheet many recall today. Did you rush to get the comics, including Priscilla's Pop? Before the internet, kids sent in their questions to Ask Andy. During World War II, Richard Davis's Dear Joe column kept those in the military up to date with what was happening at home. Ray McBride wrote the column during the Vietnam War. McBride also contributed stories about his children in his All in the Family column. The advice column by Ione Quinby Griggs was a very popular mainstay of the Green Sheet from 1934 to 1985. Over the decades, it became quite the community forum for her Midwestern readers. Syndicated columnist Irma Bombeck provided many a laugh. So did resident humorist Gerald Kloss with his column Slightly Kloss-eyed. Dan Chabot, the editor from 1981 until the Green Sheet ended its run in 1994, was the Greenskeeper columnist. 20 years later, Dan was invited by the Milwaukee Public Library to speak at an event, Remember When? Everyone read the Green Sheet. For decades, the library had contributed historic photos for the popular Remember When feature. A retrospective of the Milwaukee Journal Green Sheet is on display at the Central Library through May of 2014.
I think about the Green Sheet, I think of a very mellow, very gentle, kind of homespun thing, but it wasn't that way at all at the beginning, was it?
No, not at all. It started off in the 1920s as a competitor to William Randolph Hearst's sensational Wisconsin News.
Really?
And Hearst, of course, was notorious for his sensationalism.
Oh, yeah. If it bled, it led.
Yes, exactly. And he loved to run stories about Hollywood sex scandals and grisly murders.
He was in on half of them.
Yes, he was. Yes.
Wasn't there a problem, even to the extent that, of home delivery for the Green Sheet?
There was. The Green Sheet was considered so naughty because it was trying to keep up with Hearst's sensationalism that it ran a lot of similar stuff. And it was sold only on the street back in the early days because it was considered too naughty to be put into conservative Milwaukee homes where women and children might see it. God forbid.
Yes. We had to defend those poor little eyes.
Yes.
That's funny, though, when I think of the Green Sheet that I grew up with, which was very family-oriented. Well, let's go back to the beginning. When did the Green Sheet start?
Well, there was a Green Sheet way back in 1913, but
really?
It was a green sheet. It was just a sports section, basically, one side, two sides, and it had the late sports scores and all of that. But it died during World War I because of paper shortages and for other reasons. And then it was resurrected in the early 20s as a competitor to Hearst's sensationalism, and it ran that way until 2 pages, just front and back, green paper, until about 1934. Then it became 4 pages.
Was it always green?
It was always green.
Why?
Yes. Well, strange story. Lucius Niemann was the founder of the Milwaukee Journal.
The great Lucius Niemann, yes.
And the simple story is this. Green was his favorite color, so they asked him, what kind of color paper do you want to use for this thing? And he said, green, of course.
I love it.
But you will also notice green delivery trucks by the Journal, green newspaper tubes on the mailboxes. Green is all over the Journal.
And that was Mr. Niemann?
That was Mr. Niemann, yes.
And wasn't there, oh, God, I'm racking my brain. There's some story about Lucius Neiman. I think it was Mrs. Neiman and Billy 60.
Yes.
And it's not what it sounds like, folks. It wasn't that kind of a story.
Not at all. It's a horse racing story. Because Billy 60 was a longtime Journal sports writer.
Sure.
I think maybe for 60 years, for all I know.
Going like 60.
Yes, going like 60, yes. And he used to hang out with the Neimans because they used to play golf together and they were great friends. And they were in Florida, as the story goes, back in the 20s. And Mrs. Neiman prevailed on Billy 60 to place a bet on a long shot horse called Lucius.
Lucius.
Whose colors, incidentally, were green and white.
And Mr. Neiman was not a gambler.
He was not a gambler, so she had to do this.
Didn't approve of it.
No, she had to do this surreptitiously with Billy 60. He placed the bet. The horse came in as an 8-to-1 long shot and paid off handsomely.
Seriously.
So, and the jockey's colors were green and white. So maybe that had something to do with it too.
Oh, I love it. Did Mr. Neiman, do we know if he ever found out?
I don't know. I don't know. He might have.
Yes, but we'll keep it. I'm sure Billy 60 didn't know. Billy 60 must have been very close if he was willing to place a bet that he knew that his boss was not going to approve of.
I think so.
Lucius Neiman did not take things lightly.
No, he was a very serious man, from what I understand. Yeah.
How did the World War I affect the Green Sheet? You saw a little bit that eventually they had to cut it off, but wasn't there a sort of a recurring letter from home or something that went on during that time?
Yeah, but that didn't appear until World War II.
Oh, that was World War II.
Yeah,
okay.
that came along in World War II. And it was instituted as a way for Milwaukee, Wisconsin families to keep in touch with their servicemen overseas. And there's a funny story about the editor at the time, Larry Lawrence, ran a snapshot once in 1942, I think it was, of a Milwaukee soldier sitting on a rock on some far-flung Pacific atoll somewhere, reading the Green Sheet. And within the next couple of weeks, he was flooded with similar pictures.
Really?
Of guys reading Green Sheets all over Europe and the Pacific.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
It was, that is so Milwaukee.
Isn't it?
It is a wonderful story. And that's the sort of Green Sheet that I remember, not the one that you couldn't send into the home.
No.
But how did the Depression, or let me put it this way, did the Depression affect the Green Sheet?
I don't think so, because the Green Sheet was one of those things that people just loved. And they wanted it in their home, and you don't cut out the things that you love. I'm sure a lot of people did cut out the Journal during hard times.
Probably.
But I think the Journal in those days, probably the Green Sheet especially, was passed around from family to family. You know, maybe one family on the block gets it, and it mixed around to the whole block after a while.
It ended up with a fish.
Yes, and ended up with a fish or at the bottom of the bird cage.
Bottom of the bird cage, yes. But never the Green Sheet.
Yes, never the Green Sheet. Incidentally, the Green Sheet had a much more noble afterlife than the rest of the paper, which wound up wrapped around fish, because a lot of people discovered that the Journal, Green Sheet, and the Sunday comics made great wrapping paper if you ran short of the regular stuff.
You know, I thought my mother was the only one who did that.
Oh, no.
Really?
Many people did that, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I did for years. That was Christmas wrapping was the funny paper.
Yeah.
But by the way, that was one of the big things in the Green Sheet, was the comic section as well. And we'll talk about how it sort of morphed from one page into so many different things. You mentioned Larry Lawrence. Wasn't he the original editor?
He was.
And when did he become the editor?
He became editor in 1927, I believe.
Prior to that, it was just sort of a revolving thing?
It was kind of I don't think they had a permanent editor. It was just a revolving thing. But when he took it over in 1927, he began softening up the rough edges and the scandalous edges, and turned it into what we saw in its later existence.
Was it Larry Lawrence who came up, and if it was, God bless him, with the idea of putting pictures of pretty girls in there?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I've got, in my presentation, I've got some old Green Sheet covers, and there's, without fail, there's always a pretty girl, at least one on the cover.
Yes, with a fair amount of leg showing.
Yes, fair amount of leg showing, yes. He was famous for what passed for cheesecake in those days.
It was so innocent.
Oh, it was, yes. Just girls in bathing suits, you know, something you could see by going out on the beach any day, anywhere.
Yes, but this way we had it all winter long.
Yes.
What are some of the other changes that went on in the Green Sheet? It became very, was it always going to be a feature type thing? I mean, after we got rid of the Hearst competition?
Yeah, I think he softened it up, softened up the edges, and went heavily toward humorous stories, the human condition, the funny things that happen to people. They had humor columnists constantly, even up till the end with Jerry Kloss, who was probably the most famous humorist.
I was going to mention Jerry Kloss. He wrote I think it wasn't it called Slightly Kloss-eyed?
Slightly Kloss-eyed, yes.
And it was a wonderful, I don't know how, I always admire people who can write, because he was a guy that, I mean, every night that thing, or 3 times a week, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And it had to be good.
Yes.
And he could always do it.
And he kept that up for 29 years, something like that. And his colleagues always accused him of having the entire works of Shakespeare rolling around in his head.
Really?
Because he could spout Shakespeare at the drop of a couplet and make up his own spin-offs on Shakespeare. It was just hilarious.
Didn't he write one to you?
He did. Toward the end, we wanted to get him to participate, if we could, in this program at the Milwaukee Public Library.
Mm-hmm. Which I should mention you do, and it's a presentation talking about what we're talking about tonight.
Yes, the library people last year asked me if I'd be interested in coming in and just doing a retrospective on the Green Sheet. So I asked Jerry if he would like to participate. And he wrote back and said he was not leaving home much these days. He's, I think, in failing health, and he stays pretty close to his recliner and doesn't go up much. So, but he did send me a little brief couplet that said something like, of all the sad words from my recliner are these, I must be a decliner.
Oh.
And that's the way he declined my invitation.
How important was it to the Green Sheet to discover one Ione Quimby Griggs?
That was probably one of the greatest finds that the Green Sheet ever came across, because she was such a treasure. She was a heirloom within an heirloom,
yes,
so to speak.
And she became the mainstay of the Green Sheet.
Oh, yes.
In many ways, of the journal.
Yes. A lot of people read the journal, or the Green Sheet, specifically because of Mrs. Griggs' advice. She handed out marriage counseling and health counseling, and in the early years, in marriage counseling as things went on.
And she became this sort of archetypical, very proper little old lady with the hat on at all times.
Yes. She was a bundle of eccentricities. She wore the little hat. And
yes. And one of the eccentricities extended to her telephone, didn't it?
Her telephone, yes, was a subject of much interest in the newsroom, because you could hear this faint telephone ringing, and nobody knew where it was coming from until we finally figured out that it was Mrs. Griggs. She kept her telephone in her desk drawer.
I love that.
And it was closed because the constant jangling interrupted her concentration.
Oh, that's funny. We talked about the fact that the comic section was in the Green Sheet. It was a big section, had a lot of stuff in it. Some of my favorites, I go back to Mark Trail and Mary Worth, which were really kind of like mini soap operas then, weren't they?
They were. In many ways, the many comic strips like Mary Worth and Rex Morgan, MD, and Mark Trail, they were all just mini soap operas, like Ma Perkins and young Dr. Malone were on the radio.
Now we're really dating ourselves.
Now we're going back, yes.
Be careful of that. But over the years, comics morphed, and they became very different. I'm thinking of the time of Doonesbury, for example.
Yes, several of the cartoons became very political. Another one was Mallard Fillmore.
Mallard Fillmore.
On two ends of the extreme.
Right.
And they finally, I think the journal finally decided they should move these off of the comic strip pages because they were so controversial. And I believe they moved them onto the editorial pages.
I think so.
Or the op-ed pages.
Oh, what an interesting comment.
Yes, yes. In the old days, though, they weren't political at all.
Now, Lil Abner used to get into
Well, yeah, Lil Abner.
It was always satire.
And Pogo, it was satire.
Pogo?
Yes.
Oh, I would love to. I never got to meet Walt Kelly. I would love to have met him, the creator of Pogo.
Yeah.
Did you ever meet him?
I never did. But my boss was George Lockwood. He was assistant managing editor for features at the Journal, and he actually wrote a book about Walt Kelly because he was a personal friend.
Wow.
Yeah.
Any idea what he was like? Do you ever hear any anecdotes?
No, I really didn't.
Oh,
No.
we've met the enemy and he is us.
Yes, his most famous
I
quote
think
of
so.
all time. Yes.
That and Deck Us All with Boston Charlie. You ran some interesting things in the Green Sheet. You ran contests.
Yes.
And
yes.
the one that stuck in my mind, because I should have won it, was the worst handwriting.
I wrote a column called The Greenskeeper, which itself, the name of that column came from a reader contest. We had a contest to pick a name for my new column,
Okay.
which became The Greenskeeper. And one of my first columns was a search for the worst handwriting in Milwaukee. And the mail just flooded us. A lot of people out there with bad handwriting, besides yourself.
Yes, could you read any of the entries?
That was the problem. We almost outfoxed ourselves because it was a hard time reading the entries.
Oh.
Or picking a winner.
Yes.
You know?
Now, professionals such as physicians had to be excluded.
We disqualified physicians because on the grounds that they were professionals at bad handwriting.
Oh, that's funny. Because my mother used to tease me about the fact my handwriting was so bad I should become a physician. Didn't work.
That seems to be one of the pre-qualifications.
I think so. Yes. There was another. There was another contest that just went right through my mind. It'll come to me at midnight. Leave your number and I'll
okay.
call you. All of you, actually.
Okay.
But there were other columns. What was Ask Andy? I remember that.
Ask Andy was a syndicated column, came from Associated Press or somebody.
Oh,
like
okay.
that. So it wasn't created locally, but a lot of local kids would write in, kids especially, would write in asking questions about physics questions, science questions, political questions. Andy would answer them all. And he would, in the early days, he would send anybody who wrote him a letter that he published a full set of the Encyclopedia Britannica.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. No, it was the World Book. I take that back.
Must have given out a lot of copies of the World Book.
I think he did. I think that's why he probably finally had to cease doing that.
Probably, yes. There was, so that was syndicated, but we all reacted to it as if it were the same.
Sure.
What about was it you that got into the thing about we should have a Wisconsin song?
Yes. Well, that was one of my that wasn't a contest really, but I lamented in a column one day that, gee, there's all these songs out there about other states and cities.
New York, Moon Over Miami.
Yeah, exactly. You know, Kentucky Rain and El Paso and Abilene. And I said, where are the songs about Milwaukee?
What's
and
wrong with
Wisconsin?
us?
Yes. So my readers just flooded us again with songs that some of them didn't exist. They just made them up on the spot, fictional song titles. Like, for example, The Farmer and Adele. What was one of the other ones? There was just a bunch of really clever ones.
And some of them were real songs.
My Begonia from Caledonia was another one.
Ooh.
But there were a lot of real songs on Wisconsin, of course. But
Yeah.
On the line with some really.
Didn't one of the songs make it onto the Tonight Show?
Yes, there was a song called "I Went for a Walk in Oconomowoc." And back in the old days, Johnny Carson had a stump the band.
Right.
They'd throw a song title at the band, and they'd play it, if they could. And this one stumped them. They could not come up with the tune to "I Went for a Walk in Oconomowoc."
I went for a walk in Oconomowoc, Oconomowoc, Oconomowoc. You know who wrote that?
No.
George Comte,
Really?
who's the former general
From
manager
WTMJ.
of WTMJ Radio and Television. I'm not sure when he wrote it, but yes, he wrote that song.
I'll be darned.
And I knew him well enough to call him by his first name, Mr. Yeah, but yeah, there was. I don't know why that sticks in my mind, but it always did.
Yeah. And there were several like that. Famous one was, how does it go? It's something about Sheboygan. It was, remember Bob and Ray?
Mention My Name in
Mention My
Sheboygan.
Name in
The
Sheboygan.
greatest little town in the world.
Yes.
Yes.
And even the Everly Brothers recorded Mention My
Seriously?
Name in Sheboygan. Yes. It was on one of their albums. And the famous version was the one that Bob and Ray used on their radio program. Mention My Name in Sheboygan. Yeah.
Yep, the greatest little town in the world. Mention my name, but please don't tell them where I am. Well, you've heard it all tonight, folks. What is an overline?
An overline was there almost from day one, from the first green sheet I ever saw. It's the line that goes across the top of the page, and it's usually a quip or a pun or a little joke that fits in so many characters of type across the top. And they were usually written by copy editors, or some people, freelancers, would send us some. And some of them we just stole on the grounds that jokes really have no father. So,
Well,
you know.
Stealing material in show business is kind of de rigueur.
Yes, yes.
Do you remember any?
There was a woman who marries a man, how did that go? A woman who marries a man thinking she will correct his ways. No, that's not right.
It's gone.
It's gone.
There's one that sticks in my mind, and it was something to the effect of, and certainly politically incorrect these days, but if your wife wants to learn to drive,
Yes.
don't stand in her way.
Stand in her way. That was from the 50s, a very politically incorrect time.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But there was corny things like that,
Yeah, they
but
were.
things that we all loved. We mentioned Larry Lawrence was the first editor. Who edited it after Larry?
The second editor was Wade Mosby,
Oh, okay.
who was a very talented writer himself. He also ran the TV section in the journal in those days. And he also wrote a column called We Like It Here. And he wrote a lot of other features. And he figured in one of the journal's major dust-ups with readers.
Really?
He decided one day, I think it was 1973, that the comic strips were too easy. So
Not comic
I mean,
strips.
not the crossword puzzles.
Crossword puzzles.
I'm sorry. The crossword puzzles were too easy. So he got a new supplier of much harder crossword puzzles, and boy, did he hear it. I remember one reader wrote to him saying, "Mosby, walk east till your hat floats." people were really
A
angry.
famous Milwaukee curse.
Yes, famous Milwaukee curse.
But but you don't want to mess with people's crossword puzzles.
No. He had to compromise finally. He had to go back to an easy one day and a hard one the next day.
I would think easier ones on Mondays because you're kind of hungover.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and then you get at the end of the week, you're kind of.
Beginning of the week, you're trying to get started.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that is funny. And when did you get to be the editor?
I became editor in 1981 after.
What had you been doing prior to that?
Before that, I had been an assistant editor of the old Insight magazine. Remember
sure.
that Sunday magazine? I'd been assistant editor there, and then before that, I'd been a copy editor on other sections of the paper.
What, by the way, does the editor do?
The editor primarily decides what goes into the paper.
Oh.
You have all of these avenues to choose from: wire stories, your columnists, journal writers themselves, and you have so much space every day to fill up after the comic strips and everything else is accounted for. And you just have to, it's primarily a system of allotment. What do you put where and on what day? And you're the coordinator, you're the maestro, so to speak.
You've got a lot of people throwing things at you.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, not always soft things either.
No.
No, I would think that the editor, because I see you as the guy that's keeping my name out of print.
Yeah.
And I don't want that. Why isn't my article in there?
Yes, yes. We had a lot of freelancers who just were very good Wisconsin writers.
Yeah.
We were kind of a home for a lot of talented Wisconsin writers. We ran a lot of freelance things.
We had some wonderful writers with the Journal. I'm thinking about Richard Davis.
Richard Davis, yes.
Was a superb writer.
Oh, he was excellent. Yes.
You go back and read his stuff, and I somewhere, again, one of my bookcases, I've got a book of his stuff. It's really good. And there was I hate to call him an outdoor writer because he was so much more than that, but he was a really good writer who happened to write about the outdoors, Gordon McQuarrie.
Oh, Gordon McQuarrie, yes.
Did you ever deal with him?
No, he was a little before my time
Okay.
there. I dealt more with a guy named Mel Ellis.
Mel Ellis. Oh, I knew you were going to say that, yeah.
Yeah, he took over, I think, after McQuarrie. And
He's also a wonderful writer.
oh, we had some magnificent people. Yeah, and every great journal name you ever remember probably at one time or another had a story in the Green Sheet.
Well, I would think so. And I would think eventually that would be, you'd kind of like that because you probably had a little bit more room to write something a little bit longer.
Yes, yes. And some people you wouldn't think would have a great sense of humor would write some pretty interesting stuff for the Green Sheet. Yeah.
Being a humorous writer has got to be the toughest thing in the world.
Oh,
Because
yes.
You got to write it, and by the time you get finished with it, and then the editor gets finished with it, and everybody else you look at it and think, oh, yuck.
Yeah.
And yet it still has to be funny.
Yeah. And that's hard to do day after day or even 3 times a week.
Was it a dream job for you, Dan?
Oh, very much so, yes. I always said I had the best job at the Journal. Of all the things that I felt I was well suited for, that was number 1 on my list. I'd never given it much thought, but then when Wade retired, I thought, well, maybe I'll apply for this. So I did and went through a process, and sure enough, I wound up as Green Sheet editor. And I loved it. It was just one of the greatest job I ever had.
Well, you certainly got to deal with some fascinating people and talented people.
Oh, yes, yes, very much
From
so.
Kloss to Griggs to, who were some of the others that I'm...
Oh, Jay Scriba, I don't know if you remember him. Walden Porterfield, Jackie Luhais, later on was a great Green Sheet writer. Alicia Armstrong, who wrote a lot of animal zoo type stories.
You were bringing back so many memories.
Oh, yeah.
All right, why the heck did they drop the Green Sheet?
Well, that's a good question.
Well, we got 30 seconds. Take your shot.
That decision was made a little over my head, you know, above my pay grade. But I think there were 3 reasons. One, there was a rap on the Green Sheet that it never carried enough advertising to pay for itself. But I always looked on it as
It's
green,
what brings everybody in.
Yes, I looked at it as the green goose that laid golden eggs. It was the Journal's loss leader.
I love that.
It brought everybody else into the store. Another reason was the green newsprint made complications for the production department.
Oh.
And I think there was
They had to do a separate
press run, separate color paper, needed special handling. And I think over time there was some resistance.
somewhere in there, and just because I know corporate life a little bit, somebody brought in a consultant from out of town and said, well, we don't need that. That's just taking an extra run.
That's probably part of it too.
Ugh.
And in the late 90s or early middle 90s, they did bring in some management from out of town. And I don't think they ever quite understood what the Green Sheet was or appreciated that it was a Milwaukee and Wisconsin icon, part of Milwaukee's personality.
It was a tradition.
Yes.
You ought to do more than a presentation. You ought to write a book about this.
Yeah, maybe I should.
Anyway, Dan, thank you so much. I wanted to do this show for so long. Glad you're in town. Living in Florida now, just back to do a presentation about the Green Sheet. Nice to have you with us. It's always nice to have you with us. I hope you'll join us next time as we continue to remember.
You.
Dan, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.